going to be talking on Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights and the theme of home. What does it mean? And that basically is all going to be in chapter 5. So, when people, Victorians, were introduced to this novel, this novel was met with a lot of negative reviews, which was pretty natural given that this novel does not basically obey what is considered or does not follow the structure of a realist novel. Like I said last time, it's a hybrid novel, and basically it has a lot of other genres that participate in the making of this novel, and so it was met by basically contested reviews. Some of them thought it wasn't interesting and original, but a lot of the early ones were really negative. Some of them said that the novel was basically too coarse and disagreeable to be attractive. A lot of them thought that the setting inside the house was basically claustrophobic, and they thought that the details were really minute and that basically were really elaborate and boring. Like I said, a lot of them thought that the extreme emotions that are felt and experienced by the characters were just a little bit like too much or over the top, and the violence that is depicted was just something that they were not used to. Like I said, a lot of other reviews thought that the novel had actually some promise. One of the reviewers of the Spectator said that the novel was original and had a lot of imaginative power. So they did not know, of course, who the author of the novel was, because Emily Bronte wrote under a pseudonym, and it was Alice Bell. Because I told you last time that women were not allowed to write and publish. So many of these women, we have a lot of Victorian female authors, and they all wrote under those pseudonyms at the time. So again, those reviewers just did not know what to make out of this novel, because, like I said, this novel combines a lot of elements, generic styles that these people were just not used to. For example, the Gothic elements, in terms of style and content, they go beyond the expectations of what a realist novel would represent. And we said the realist novel around that time was the dominant literary form for all intents and purposes. It was the form that the bourgeoisie basically produced, and who were basically in power and the real ruling class of Europe in the 19th century. And the realistic details of this novel also go beyond the usual expectations of the Gothic novel. So it cannot be a Gothic novel, it cannot be a realist novel. So what is it? So it's a mix, like I said. The characterization, the characters, are particularly problematic because they are drawn in realistic detail. However, they still have very puzzling basically characteristics, and they are drawn in unpredictable ways, unlike the characters of typical realist novels. So these characters, although they have a lot of detail, a lot of realist characteristics in the makeup of their characters, they still have something about them, about their personalities, that is basically different. So again, especially with the characterization of Heathcliff, who is the main protagonist in this novel, he is basically a strange character that they don't know what to make of. This is the enigmatic Heathcliff. Why enigmatic? Because you really cannot read him. You really don't know what to make of his character. There is something mysterious about him, but also dark and different. And again, those probably are what those Victorians are reading, or what they are perceiving when they are faced, or when they're encountering a character like Heathcliff, because he's basically different. Heathcliff as a literary figure. Now, if we are unable to understand this character or decipher him as a realistic representation of any kind of real person, because like realist novels, the people in these novels, they're just representations of any kind of person that you would know in real life. Now, if Heathcliff cannot fit any of those slots, all right, then what is he? Now, critics, literary critics, they basically decided that his character is not a strange character in terms of literature. There has been many literary characters who have been predecessors to Heathcliff's character. For example, Gothic literature often features enigmatic heroes and villains. So it's not something that is that's basically new or unheard of. Okay, so and also there is the Byronic Lord Byron, who also wrote the Byronic hero, and the Byronic hero basically existed 40 years before the characterization of Heathcliff's character. So probably Emily Bronte was influenced by the Byronic hero's character when she drew Heathcliff's character. Of course, we've been talking in 1830A and last time about capitalism. How can capitalism make Heathcliff possible? Now, there's a critic, his name is Adam Roberts. He was following in the footsteps of Frederick Jameson. He notes that the similarities between Heathcliff and capitalism are interesting. You cannot ignore these. We said that capitalism, when it was first kicking into gear, was really energetic and dynamic and effective, but also brutal and oppressive. I mean, that's the nature of capitalist modernization. It comes in and it sweeps traditional societies and changes them irrevocably, that in a way that you cannot basically go back to tradition. So any traditional society that has been replaced with a modern society can never go back to what was before. And that is the nature of capitalism, and that is the nature of Heathcliff. If we look at Heathcliff's personality as an emblem, all right, of capitalist modernization, we will understand how his presence in Yorkshire comes to this basically he comes to this traditional society, this traditional rural society with all these farms and moors. He enters this setting from Liverpool. Heathcliff is brought by Mr. Earnshaw from Liverpool, if you recall, you guys, and if you're already reading the novel. So Mr. Earnshaw brings Heathcliff from Liverpool to Wuthering Heights, to Yorkshire, and to Wuthering Heights particularly, right? And that is a place that is still basically rural. However, it's on the cusp of all that change that is happening in England. England here at this time was changing and basically was modernizing, and there is a shift toward the urbanization of everything, that it comes basically in conjunction with capitalist modernization. And so if we look at him as an emblem of that change that is happening, it's easier for us to understand why a character like Heathcliff is a possible character and why he comes to exist, basically. All right, if we look at the remote setting of Wuthering Heights, it identifies, like I've told you, the rural past, the tradition. England by the 19th century is dominated by the bourgeoisie, who have become completely entrenched and completely conservative, because they at this point made sure that they have the power in terms of the economic structure, in terms of the money, And so if you have the money, then you basically control the whole society, even in terms of the politics and everything else. And so there are areas like Yorkshire that were still rural, that are still traditional, but like I've said, they are basically, even if they're isolated, they're not going to be isolated for so long. They ultimately need to join the mainstream society and join the rest of the urban cities in that process. So Yorkshire had all these moors where Wuthering Heights is located. It's a remote area. It's isolated from capitalist modernization, but it is underway in the under basically it is underway in terms of modernization, but it's still, the modernization there is not complete. All right, it is not complete. The weather in Wuthering Heights is tumultuous. If we look at the weather in terms of it being tumultuous, all wind and, just like unsettled, let's say, it's probably, if we look at it, it's like a crisis of the traditional ways that Yorkshire is under a lot of threat and a lot of pressure of the power of capitalist modernization, that they need to change, that they need to do things differently. So the fact that Heathcliff is from Liverpool, like I've already mentioned to you, helps us to identify him as an outsider. And we said the theme in chapter 5 of your book is the theme of home. Home represents what? Okay, basically a specific way of looking at things, a domestic way of looking at things, that you don't accept any change. Any change that you want to do is unwelcomed by those people. Let's see. And of course, Heathcliff represents that change. And if he represents that change, in terms of those people who are clinging, for example, to the past, would they accept him? I mean, if we look at the character of Heathcliff as an emblem of modernization, we just don't look at him as a person. Just look at him as an emblem. He's marked as an outsider. He's a force of capitalist modernization. And of course, he's going to be rejected, and he's going to be what? He's going to be resisted. And that is natural. All kinds of traditional societies that ultimately changed, they met probably the change at the beginning, and with not with arms basically wide open. They resisted that change, but ultimately they had to surrender to it. So like I said, where Heathcliff comes from, Liverpool was actually an important shipping center, and it had well-established glass and iron working and clock making. And so all that industries that was basically kicking into gear. This is Liverpool. This is how Liverpool looked around the end of the 18th century, which is when Wuthering Heights is set, because we know that Wuthering Heights is set at the end of the 18th century. We said 1871, I guess, when the boy Heathcliff arrives in Yorkshire, and it ends at the very beginning of the 19th century. Liverpool, of course, is also a symbol of modernity. Like I said, it's a manufacturing center, and it's the locus of a burgeoning industrial revolution. And we know that capitalism becomes really firmly established in England in the 19th century, probably, let's say, the first half of the 19th century. So it's a population center, Liverpool. It serves as a key destination point as the key English population began a dramatic shift from the country to the city. As a shipping center, also Liverpool was a key point of contact between England and the rest of the world. And basically, it was linked also to colonialism. This is how England colonized the rest of the areas where it ultimately colonized. It was through those shipping centers, because these shipping centers were their connection to the rest of the world, because your theme in your book is chapter 5 is home and chapter 6 is abroad. And so we have a connection between home. England represents home, and England and the rest of the world that England ultimately colonizes is considered the world of abroad. Of course, Liverpool, given its location, is also important and crucial for the connection and the point of contact between England and Ireland, because Ireland also was a British colony for a very long time, and it was under British rule. And we will even look at Ireland when we study James Joyce later on this semester. So again, if we go back to the story and the narrative, this story, Wuthering Heights, has a very unconventional narrative in terms of many things. The narrative voice of the novel, the plot of the novel, the structure of the novel, all of these basically are what makes this novel really unique. So, and the narrative voice in the novel further destabilizes this novel. Generally, in 19th century realist novels, we have a single narrator. This single narrator is generally an authoritative narrator. He's omniscient. Omniscient is a person with authority, like basically he's godlike. All right, you don't question his narration, uh, and the narration generally is in third person voice. And typically, we would just have the assumption that the authority and the narration is coming from a male, from a guy. All right. Now, in Wuthering Heights, we have a narrator that we know, Lockwood, if you remember from the very beginning in chapter 1. He is not authoritative at all. He's a stranger. He's an outsider. He doesn't even know, like, he doesn't even comprehend all these things that he's encountering and the things that are happening around him. So he is basically in the same position that we are in as readers. So he's not in a position to explain things. He's trying to understand them as the narration moves forward. And so he's completely, there's like a big disparity between what we know generally about an omniscient conventional narrator versus Lockwood. That's number one. Now we even have more than one narrator. So conventionally, we have only one omniscient, authoritative narrator. In this novel, we have basically three narrators or three narration styles. So we have Lockwood, like I said, he's an outsider. Then we have a woman, female narrator, Nellie Dean. But she's considered, for all intents and purposes, an unreliable narrator. Why? Of course, the narration, like I said, it shifts in chapter 4, where Nellie is the narrator, and her narration is filtered through Lockwood as a frame narrator. So Lockwood remains the frame narrator, and she's basically the narrator within the frame narrator. We hear the story through Lockwood, and that's actually a possibility for the narration to get distorted. So she tells him something, he might misunderstand it, or basically build his own ideas on what that means. And so we hear it from him. And so it's a second-hand, basically, narration that might be distorted along the way. Also, Nellie Dean is prejudiced in her narration, and she's opinionated. Number one, we know that she hates Heathcliff. She doesn't like Heathcliff. And so she might say things from her point of view that make him seem evil or whatever. And these things are just basically don't come from an objective point of view. And it is always important that we have a reliable narrator. Another thing, if you look at it in terms of textuality, women don't narrate in the Victorian time. And this also narration comes from a maid. Nellie Dean is a maid in the house. Also, another narration voice that we have is Catherine's diary and Isabella's letter. So these are letters and diaries that we read. And so these basically further complicate the narrative voice in this novel. Um, okay, like I said, you guys, just remember if you are gonna watch the movie, that the movie differs significantly from the novel, because in the novel the focus is really on the focus is on the interior of the house, what's happening inside the house. And a lot of the critics who were reading, they said that the setting of the house, Wuthering Heights, reminds them of a prison. All right? A prison which might be pictured from life. Let us hope the author will spare us further interiors so gloomy as the one here elaborated with such dismal minuteness. So that's the major commentary that we get, and criticism is that there's a lot of focus on the interior, that it just gets so boring. But in the movie, they focus more on the moorlands, on the outside, and that is basically not true to the novel. So be aware of that. Um, the first encounter for Lockwood with Wuthering Heights, the house, and his description is that there is, and we have, of course, this very minute description by him. He describes the dishes, the jugs, etc., all of these details that are in the house, um, uh, whatever is hanging under the chimney, and then above the chimney, sorry, and then the dog that is lurking in the area. All of this that just gives you the atmosphere of something ominous that is about to happen and take place. So it's kind of like a Gothic atmosphere. Um, Also, Lockwood mentions tea in the very first chapter. Um, like I said, he mentions tea, and tea was considered an expensive commodity that they brought in England all the way from India. It kind of also when Lockwood mentions tea, it's a good emblem here to keep in mind the connection of England with the colonial world. Also, another thing is that he says that the house is well ordered. Um, it kind of looks like any other house that you would find in the area. However, he said there's just something, a quality about it, some haunted, basically, just reminds him of a haunted house quality. Um, it's the thing is, I think it's about the inhabitants of the house more than the structure of the house, and how basically the house is designed on the inside, or the interior of the house. This is the house in the 2009 TV adaptation of Wuthering Heights. I mean, you can see, you get the idea of the haunted house quality. I mean, this reminds me of any Gothic movie that basically revolves around an idea of a haunted house. Um, Again, like I said, he even says, Lockwood, he says this house, the apartment and furniture would have been nothing extraordinary, as belonging to a homely northern farmer. All right. So it'd be like any house in the area, nothing like that stands out, or like nothing that is weird. However, but Mr. Heathcliff forms a singular contrast to his abode and style of living. So it's all about the inhabitants of the house, like I've said, that those people basically just don't fit together, and there's something strange about them, especially Heathcliff. And you already know, by the time that Lockwood appears there, the people who live in the house are Heathcliff, young Kathy, Catherine's daughter, and then we have Hareton, who is Hindley's son, who is basically demoted to be just some kind of servant in the house. And so just like all these people just don't fit together, because that doesn't represent a nuclear family the way that the Victorians pictured. It's like, they were very obsessed with the idea of domesticity and how like a domestic setting should be like. And this just basically does not fit their idea of how a family a unit or a Victorian home should be. All right, so in chapters 1 to 3, we know that Lockwood goes again. He's intrigued. What is going on in this house? I want to know, basically. So he decides to go all by himself on a walk, and basically gets half frozen. And he reaches Wuthering Heights, and he is not really welcomed there. He comes without informing those people that he's visiting them, and they're not expecting him. And so he is just shocked that these people are just, like I said, they're not welcoming. And even when they invite him in, ultimately, because the man is basically half frozen, their reception of him was just not a conventional one. Generally, like, you invite people, you're nice to them. And he basically invited himself over for a cup of tea. When he's speaking to young Kathy, this conversation between Lockwood and young Kathy is kind of comical, and it goes on over like several pages. And it just, where basically Lockwood's social platitude basically come up against Catherine, or Kathy, let's say, overt hostility. So Catherine here, young Kathy, is really hostile toward him. He says, "Can I have some tea?" And she's like, "Did I invite you over for tea?" Like, and he's like, "Oh, like, I don't know what to say." So yeah, unwelcoming and really hostile. And Hareton is like all, he just like his brushness, and Heathcliff's increasing savagery, according to Lockwood, of course. So all these people, like I said, just don't fit together. And ultimately, basically, the dog attacks Lockwood outside the door. So suddenly you have a comic situation that, like, in just one moment, shifts into a very brutal one. And like I said, this really doesn't go with the general structure and general content of what you would have in a realist novel of the time. So the novel also puts a lot of emphasis on windows. You see a lot of characters who are sitting near windows and looking outside, longing to escape. All right. Kathy, Catherine, Isabella, all of these people. So also the windows are really narrow in the description, and they are set in deep walls. And so that produce a feeling of claustrophobia. Outside the house, if you are outside the house, like I said, there are moors and landscapes, but there isn't a lot of focus on the outside. The focus is really on the inside. However, you feel like the landscape is abandoned. We said before, it's secluded, and the weather seems to be, like I said, tumultuous, a lot of wind, which would make no sense when you compare Wuthering Heights to Thrushcross Grange, which is the houses on the opposite side of Wuthering Heights. All right, let's move forward. All right, let's see if this is... Like I said, guys, this is like more points here on the film adaptations, that really the Moorlands dominate the film adaptations. So if you only watch the movie, you would get the wrong idea on the structure, because the landscape doesn't really figure much in the actual novel. But we hear at some point Nellie Jean saying that Catherine and Heathcliff, they love to run away to the moors when they were children. They love to be there all the time. So as like an escape for them. All right. All right, if we move to the home at Thrushcross Grange, what are the differences between these two? There are pages between 41 to 42 that show the first description in the novel of Thrushcross Grange. When Heathcliff and Catherine are there, when they used to go there, and observe the house and the inhabitants. Their first description is retold, of course, by Nelly Dean, is that the Grange is a nice house. It kind of reminds them of like heaven. They said it's like heaven, all right? And that there is a lot of contrast in the interior between this house and Wuthering Heights. Now, we really don't know whether these differences stem from your own psychology of not liking where you are. It's like when you're in Wuthering Heights and you're met with hostility, like Heathcliff, of course, he's going to look at the Grange and see all the people there who look or seem to be happy and feel that the Grange is a better fit maybe for him. So one of the things that they say is that basically there is one evening when Heathcliff and Catherine are standing outside Wuthering Heights, and they're shivering, and it's like really cold and rainy because Hindley, Catherine's brother, he will not let them in. All right, during those Sunday evenings. So Henley and his wife and son are sitting, which is Hareton, who's Hareton. They're sitting inside, singing, laughing, and enjoying their Sunday evening. Then basically Heathcliff and Catherine go and look outside, look into Thrushcross Grange through their window, the inhabitants there, the Lintons, okay? And it makes him feel that this family is a happier family, that they don't have the same hypocrisy that the family at Wuthering Heights has. And so to him, he feels that this family at the Grange is living in more harmony than the people in Wuthering Heights. And at that point, he even says that the Grange is like heaven. But we really don't know whether Heathcliff really said that or whether Neely Dean is basically making that up. And so again, and at the end of the day, if you're really comparing these two houses to each other as the story progresses, and as we see all the dysfunctional behavior by Isabella Linton and by her brother, we come to realize that the people in the Grange are not far off. They're not that different from people of Wuthering Heights. But it's just an interesting commentary on basically not believing totally everything that you see on the outside, and that once you dig deep, you don't really find that difference between these two houses. So we are led to think at the very beginning that the inhabitants of Thrushcross Grange are more civilized, all right? But like I said, a lot, like we have things that happen in the Grange. For example, the dogs at the Grange also attack Catherine, the same way that the dogs at Wuthering Heights attack Lockwood. We have Isabella, who basically goes through that whole thing and runs off with Heathcliff the same way that Catherine does in Wuthering Heights. And so both of these houses have their problems. They're both problematic. And we're going to talk about that symbolization of the houses in a little bit. So harsh conditions in the country, avoiding to romanticize the rural past. Now, the traditional way of life is beginning to come under pressure from capitalist modernization. In Wuthering Heights. Basically, Thrushcross Grange is reminiscent of a rural past. It romanticizes things. What does it mean to romanticize something? To just imagine that things are more beautiful or better than they actually are. And so the Thrushcross Grange represents a moment in British history that we are decidedly out of step with. And you cannot have that back. You cannot retrieve to the past. You cannot do that. It's just impossible. But Wuthering Heights is basically under the pressure of change. And that's why we see that they are under more pressure Things there are just basically more crazy, okay? Because Heathcliff himself represents what? His actions in Wuthering Heights. He's brutal. He's basically more efficient, though. And in Thrushcross Grange, they are clinging to a past that is basically under threat. All right. Nellie's account of the Grange. Nellie's account of the Grange and her opinion of the Grange also represents that rural past. She gives a brief account of the situation of Thrushcross Grange on page 83. She describes it in this very lyrical, beautiful way of all this beautiful seasons and weather and landscape. I mean, guys, if you really think about it, would it make any sense that two houses that are so near each other would have completely different weathers, completely different atmospheres? I mean, it really makes no sense on a literal level. However, if you look at this in terms of symbolism, all right, and in terms of allegory, especially an allegory of capitalism, we would know that the novel, when it comes to Thrushcross Grange, it's evoking the rural past. How beautiful things are, but look at Wuthering Heights. Things are crazy, things are out of control, things are so and so. And so people will start saying, oh, I wish that we basically clung to tradition. I wish we clung to things, to the way that things were in the past, because change can be crazy. Change can be unsettling, right? And so when Nellie Dean compares the Thrushcross Grange to Wuthering Heights, we see that that the image is completely a contrasting one. And again, when Nellie gives that romantic account of Wuthering of the Grange, she mentions those features of the Grange that, again, they are really reminiscent of a past, a rural past that is not really coming back. All right, the home and the structure of Wuthering Heights. Well, the novel in many ways is considered organized in terms of the events, and it has a very clear chronology. We know when the novel begins, when the boy Heathcliff arrives in Wuthering Heights. We know when the novel ends. We have all these details. Also, we know that there is a contrast that is symmetrical in the repetition of characters. We have Catherine, we have young Cathy, we have Linton, Edgar Linton, and then we have Linton, Isabella's son, and Heathcliff's son. We have all these contrasting characters. So we also have a moment when Catherine feels trapped at the Grange and she misses Heathcliff. We also have a moment when Isabella feels imprisoned in Wuthering Heights when she marries Heathcliff. And so all of these like imageries and all of these examples that mirror each other or stand in contrast to each other give a nice structure. The novel also, although the novel, although has this nice structure, at the same time remains stubbornly unruly. It's unruly because you cannot fit it in a certain slot or a certain structure. A lot of these characters are driven by their passion. They behave in ways that are not considered rational at all. The novel has a lot of extreme and violent events that disrupt the balance of the narrative. We do have a tight literary structure of the novel that can probably be an emblem of the strict ordering of the conventional rural society. Probably Emily Bronte, in a way, is suggesting that when we have a structure and a way of doing things, it can just basically be impoverishing, and it won't basically be beneficial to anyone, because we're basically not robots. And having things moving toward a urbanization and industrialization means that people have to behave according to certain principles. All right. Now, more about the structure and the chronology. Like I said, within this frame, the events are narrated basically that are covered by the narrators. We have Nelly, who covers more than 20 years, and then we have the rest of the story by Heathcliff, and the one occupied by Heathcliff and Catherine cover happens over the second half of the novel. So we have two plots in the novel. We have a plot for the second generation, and we have a plot for the first generation. The novel basically begins when Catherine is already dead, and it begins with the second generation. We go through the story, and then we go back to the present time. All right, let's see if there's anything here that is important. Right, romance and realism. The novel, like I said, is considered a hybrid. It's a mixture of Gothic romance and realism. It has the elements of all these three genres. A lot of the critics say that Wuthering Heights could have been a better romance if Heathcliff alone was basically that one who is weird with stormy passions. But again, we also have a female character, who does not fit in terms of romances. The term romance, of course, can just mean a novel, all right? And Catherine is not a damsel in distress. And generally, heroines or female characters in romances are just passive girls who are waiting for their man to come and save them. And so Catherine does not fall under this category. So she has all of these extreme passions, and she just basically is a revolutionary figure. And that's why this novel cannot be considered fully as a romance. All right. So, like I said, Wuthering Heights also has a lot of strong connections with Gothic romances, beyond the Gothic characteristic of Heathcliff. So, like I said, those novels generally have an atmosphere of terror. They use all these rugged setting with storms and shadows and apparitions. And there's always this threat of violence that is integral to the atmosphere of these novels. But like I said, these women are generally considered passive. But we have here Isabella and young Kathy. They are imprisoned. We generally have an incarcerated woman. A man comes and saves the woman from that. Heathcliff, in many ways, is like a Gothic hero villain. But like I said, Catherine does not represent that. She's like really a revolutionary figure. And we actually, if we look at her and we take her as the heroine of this novel, instead of Heathcliff being the hero, we can see that maybe Heathcliff can also represent her alter ego. So she's a person who cannot basically settle for what is expected by the society, by those societal restraints, by those by the what is the accepted feminine conduct. Okay. And so she wouldn't fit into this role. Okay. All right. If we look at the realistic characteristics of the of Wuthering Heights, um, basically there are the setting, the brutal truth that the novel represents about the domestic life and social exclusion and economic disposition in the novel. It is very clear. Heathcliff, also, when it comes to genealogy, Heathcliff is a man who doesn't know his genealogy. He doesn't know his origins. That plays a very big part in the story. He is not accepted, and he is considered an outsider throughout the entire novel due to the fact that we don't know where he comes from. The novel also basically uncovers many issues that were happening in England around the time. A lot of critics wrote about this topic of the working class people's condition in England. E.P. Thomason, all right, the conditions of the working class, also Frederick Engels, Karl Marx, and so they talked about the plight of the working class people, who were a whole class that was emerging in the 19th century due to people coming to England to work in all these factories, not making enough money or good wages, living in very bad and horrible conditions. They had children who were basically homeless, displaced, and we can see the commentary on that situation, Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, and Hard Times also by Charles Dickens. And so we next time also will look at Heathcliff and the possibility of him representing the basically minorities, the displaced, and those working class people who were all over England, especially the urban centers in the 19th century, working in all of these factories. Now, the things that I want you to keep in mind as you read in Wuthering Heights, and I hope that you finish this week, is the portrayal of the theme of home and of home in Wuthering Heights. What does home mean? And can you cling to the past and basically try to live secluded from mainstream society? Also, the generic complexities that are in this novel, the borrowing from other range of genres by Emily Bronte, which is brilliant, and some people probably see it as the fact that Emily Bronte was young and did not even know how to write a novel. I mean, we don't know. I mean, you can decide, it's up to you. You can write critical responses to this novel in terms of the generic qualities and what do you basically think. All right, guys.